We've also got the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sánchez. He's put international cooperation at the heart of his government, and Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and now a UN Special Envoy. Welcome.
Welcome back, everybody. I think you will agree with me that this morning was really wonderful. And we have two great leaders to pick up the threads that Prime Minister Starmer laid out in his speech. You know, since the end of World War II, as he noted, rules-based international order and collective action to meet global challenges have been the cornerstone of security and economic prosperity. That's now under attack by far-right movements in our democracies, and revisionist governments are trying to break the collective will of democratic societies, often through active measures of disinformation. Yet we know that on the big transnational issues, security, pandemics, climate change, global inequalities, terrorist attacks, no country can go it alone. And we know that when progressives are in power, multilateralism thrives and we can get big things done. For example, the support for Ukraine by a large coalition assembled to beat back the illegal war there, the JCPOA, the response to Ebola, and then COVID-19. We can do things when we work together. And today we're joined by two global leaders who have stepped up and shown what progressive leadership looks like, especially when the world needs it the most. Pedro Sánchez has served as Spain's Prime Minister since 2018, steering his country through a pandemic, deep polarization, and an economic recovery, all while doubling down on international cooperation and green transition. Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, earned global recognition for her empathy-led approach to leadership and governance. And her tenure in government, after her tenure in government, she's continued to her work on the global stage as Special Envoy for Oceania, ahead of COP30, and as a founder of the Field Fellowship, which Global Progress Action is proud to partner with her on, which promotes empathetic leadership for young, emerging public leaders. Maybe I'll get you to talk about that some. You know, we're seeing rising geopolitical insecurity, growing authoritarianism, and at the same time, many large powers are actually walking away from that leadership. So let me start with the big question, which is what kind of response do we need from progressive leaders to meet this moment of crisis? Prime Minister Sánchez, why don't we start with you?
Well, first of all, thank you, and I would like to praise also Prime Minister Starmer for convening us today. I think it's very important for progressive governments to meet and to exchange views and also experiences, and also show our citizens that we belong to a family, a broader family, which can provide common responses to the global challenges and the common challenges that all our societies share. So, talking about leadership, I think that, first of all, what we need is to have a clear vision of what we propose to our societies. And to me, at least from the Spanish perspective, but I think that this is something that we could share, is that inequality is the major challenge. So, for instance, when we speak about housing, in Spain, housing represents 60% of the inequality that is suffered by the youth or let's say, the common citizen in my country. Second, I think that we need to be determined and convinced by that vision that we propose to our citizens, and to speak clearly to our citizens about the challenges and the need to build coalitions. So far, over the last 7 years, we have been a minority government coalition without a clear majority in the parliament, but we did it quite well. Actually, we were able to reform our labor market, also our pension reform, the educational system, the scientific system in Spain without social contestation. just talking with trade unions, talking with the civil society, talking and agreeing with the business association. So it is also very important to, propose and share this vision with even people that don't think like you, but where you can find a common ground in order to move forward in that vision. And finally, I would say that we need to deliver. So, for instance, during this week in UNGA in New York, I heard some speeches and statements saying that climate change or the green transition will be an obstacle, for the economic development of our countries. The data and the experience so far in Spain is the contrary. So since I'm in office in 2018, we have been able, until 2025, to drop by 50%, 50% the electricity prices in my country, thanks to renewables. So we also need to combat and fight these narratives of the far right with data, with facts. And the good thing is that there are progressive governments around the world that deliver and show that there's another way to do things.
I told the Prime Minister in the green room that we're sending a delegation to Spain to figure out how he's reforming his electricity markets because we're in a major battle in the U.S. blaming each other for what are now prices have gone up on electricity 10% since Trump's come into office, for example. Former Prime Minister Ardern, you come from a mid-sized country. You've shown
that's an upgrade. I'll take mid-size.
Charitable. You've shown with your leadership that you can punch well above your weight and shape a more stable and cooperative world order. But what are the challenges to that coming from a place like New Zealand, and what are the opportunities for a leader such as yourself, who was so powerful when you were in office?
You're absolutely right. New Zealand, population 5 million, has historically punched above its weight. That term's used a lot, and I think when we use it, or when it's used to refer to us, I think it's really capturing the idea that, in fact, we have used the multilateral institutions at our disposal and the rules-based order to good effect. Take, for instance, the 1980s, extraordinary position New Zealand found itself in, where New Zealand's backyard in the Pacific was being used for nuclear testing. That was a cause of enormous concern for our general population, and it would be very easy for a nation of that size, and indeed our Pacific neighbours, to feel relatively powerless. And so alongside, these civil society movements, New Zealand used multilateral institutions to make pleas to try and end what was something that could have and did have catastrophic effects for the environment and for human health. And so New Zealand has been consistently a champion of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear prohibition, but using the multilateral institutions available to us. Now let's fast forward to the Pacific and climate change, the biggest threat to our region before the last US election. It is happening on our doorsteps now. Tuvalu is making pleas to make sure that they can still be recognised as a nation state if they do not have land, because this is an imminent threat for them. Now, Vanuatu has used the ICJ to get a declaration in July of this year to find that there are legal obligations on states to uphold those instruments that countries have signed up to, including the 1.5. And so small nations use these instruments because without them, what do we have? What voice does Tuvalu have? What voice does Vanuatu have? And now, of course, the ICJ, it's not binding, so Vanuatu is seeking the General Assembly to endorse the findings of the ICJ. Small nations have historically needed these institutions. So in my mind, when I hear pundits in the US say the rules-based order is dead, I ask, according to who? because I do not believe that just because one nation, who is, yes, absolutely significant in clout, population and economic power, declares that it's no longer functional, that we walk away. Nations like mine need these multilateral institutions.
Well, as I noted, multilateralism is under siege, and as you noted, these issues are really deeply interrelated. We heard a lot this morning on the topic of immigration, but the kinds of weather effects that you're seeing in Spain with fires and drought, and in the Pacific with inundation from with fresh water being destroyed by salt water, which may end these ability for people to stay on their land long before they actually sink under the water. Those things are related, but how do we make the effective case to our own publics that these multilateral solutions are really critical for their well-being? Because sometimes I don't think I could ask an American to point out where Vanuatu is on a map, and they could get even in the Pacific Ocean. So how do you do that? And maybe we'll reverse order. Jacinda, you go first, and maybe Pedro can relate to that.
Go ahead.
I mean, if your question is how do we make climate change relevant to the general population in the US, it already...
and these questions around human security.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue it already is. Ask someone in Texas whether extreme weather events are affecting their daily lives. The issue is whether or not we have political leaders who are willing to equate these two significant issues. In New Zealand, for example, forgive me continually going back to that mid-size country, but in New Zealand there's less of a debate about whether or not climate change is real because we are so weather dependent and climate affected, deeply climate affected. So that is no longer in play. Now the discussion is how much do we do and how quickly do we do it, particularly when large emitters are doing so little. And so, in my mind, a significant part of the domestic politics has to be equating some of these issues. However, I'm also a proponent for, making sure that we don't win the battle but lose the war. Maybe we don't need to convince everyone about the morality of climate action. Maybe instead we actually just find the cost of living initiatives that improve their lives that are also favourable to climate. And I use this example a lot because I love it, but the New York Times not long ago reported on an individual in the Deep South who had recently purchased an EV, an electric vehicle, for the purposes of hunting. Not because he wanted to improve the planet or the planet's outlook, but because it was quieter to sneak up on his prey. Whatever it takes, whatever it takes.
Let's stick with climate for a second. Pedro, you've been a proponent of a green transition. It's been a source of growth for you. You've already talked about the fact that you brought electricity prices down. What's your argument to the people? Do they feel the pain of extreme weather? Are they looking for the opportunity of more investment and more jobs? Is it all of the above?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is a reality, and this is not only, this is not something abstract nowadays for Spaniards, but on the contrary, it is a reality and a security concern more and more. We have calculated that over the last 10 years, on material losses, all the climate emergency consequences cost us more or less 32 billion euros and 20,000 deaths because of climate change. So this is the reality. But on the other hand, there's a lot of opportunities for Spain because of our weather, because of our geography, to develop the green transition, to profit from this green transition when it comes, for instance, to this renewable energy and its consequences on our industry. So nowadays in Spain, we are more and more witnessing a reindustrialization in green of our economic activity. So, now if you compare the figures of the industrial production growth in Spain is higher than traditional industrial countries such as Italy or France or Germany. And this is mainly because of the green transition that we started 7 years ago. But let me add that going back again to multilateralism, I think it is also very important to translate to our citizens that when we speak about multilateralism or international law, we're talking about fair causes, which means, for instance, that I am so proud to belong to a family that has governments that has recognized the Palestine statehood with the same conviction, with the same conviction and coherence as we are defending the cause of Ukrainians when it comes to the invasion of Putin.
I absolutely agree with Pedro. When you think about our next generation, who we know from surveys are feeling disenfranchised, they feel a grievance towards, interestingly, not just government, but the private sector, because they believe that they are in some way harming them or ensuring that their future, they will be worse off than the previous generation. And that grievance is lending itself to 4 out of 10 people in global surveys saying that they're willing to resort to hostile activity. For under 34s, that lifts to half. And so that group in particular, how do we demonstrate to them the importance of multilateral institutions? Firstly, relevance. And yes, it does mean demonstrating that we're acting on issues that affect young people's day-to-day lives. So domestically, as progressives, we should be making sure that they have access to healthcare and education and housing, but we've got to walk and chew gum at the same time. They also care about whether or not we're acting on behalf of humanity. So we need those multilateral institutions to say to those young people, see that massive injustice in the genocide of Gaza? We're doing something about that. We're intervening on that question. And at the moment, MIA, that's all young people will be seeing in my mind, is that those institutions are not able to have the impact that they expect. So if they want relevance, they have to demonstrate relevance to the next generation.
And is that through... Is that through the actions that they're taking, or the withholding of actions in some cases? How do they demonstrate that relevance, particularly in a case like this?
Yeah, and there's no question, incredibly complex, but for young people, they're not looking at the complexity of who has the responsibility. They just see a genocide that needs to end. From a domestic perspective, as progressives, I really applaud Pedro and his government. They have created a comprehensive list of actions to try and move the dial on this humanitarian crisis, and we need as many progressive parties as possible to do the same.
One of the other things you've done, Pedro, is even as other people have really backed off, and some major powers have, including the United States, obviously, have really backed off of the commitment to try to intervene to improve the lives of everyone around the world, deal with not just inequality in our own societies, but inequality across countries. You've made that a priority. Spain, I believe, spent $4 billion of development assistance last year under your leadership. Why have you made that a priority, and how do you sell that to your constituents?
Perhaps, John, because I've been in office since 2018. I've been in office during the pandemic as Jacinda, and in 2020 we had the opportunity to work together. I understood perfectly the need to be committed with the rest of the world, and that is why I think that from Western societies we committed a big mistake when we just focus on defense. I don't mean with this that we cannot forget that there's a challenge in the eastern flank, that we need to increase our defense expenditure, but we cannot make a trade-off between defense and development aid. But because what we need to also send to the global south and the rest of the societies is that we are committed with their health, their economic development, their future at the end of the day. Talking about migration, make no mistake, we fight against irregular migration. We fight against smugglers. But the best way to fight against smugglers and irregular migration is going to these countries of origin and transit and cooperate with them and help them to create opportunities for their people. And at the same time, of course, to allow migrant or regular migration ways in order to provide, this human capital force that we need in our countries in order to boost our economies, and then also to train these people, go back to their countries, and create the conditions for economic development. So there's in my view, a lack of empathy when you listen to some leaders saying that in front of people that are running countries of small islands, that there's no climate change, when they are seeing the rise of the sea levels and that climate change represents an existential threat. So that is why I think it's more and more important that Western societies, of course the US today is just walking away, but this is also a huge opportunity for the European Union and other Western countries in order to fill that gap and to embrace multilateralism. I think that the main duty that we have as progressive governments is to embrace multilateralism. That doesn't mean that we don't need to reform the system. We need to reform it and to provide more legitimacy to the system. But again, I think that the future of the world, and I believe also one of our major causes as progressives, is to strengthen multilateralism.
I agree. I think you can both reinforce the existing infrastructure whilst also acknowledging the need for reform. One of the things I think, though, in order to reinforce the relevance and importance of these institutions is also to deliver on what they have already set out as minimum expectations. And in the climate space, of course, that would include delivering on the Paris Agreement. For COP30, this is one of the major platforms for Brazil as the presidency for this COP is delivery. Yes, we have expectations around nations coming forward with their NDCs, but actually we have a commitment. The 1.5 that was advocated for by the Pacific was built around the threshold for where they would survive or not. So this is not a target that we try and reach to preserve parts of our ecosystem, our natural fauna and flora. Yes, that is true, but it's also actually to preserve the statehood, livelihood and cultural preservation of nation states in our region. So yes, let's work on reform, let's reinforce the importance of the institutions, but let's deliver on the commitments that we have. And it has to be possible to do that in spite of the United States. Now, I think here we should be leaning into the private sector as well. They, of course, are major contributors to fossil fuel use and energy consumption. And we've had, I think, for too long an expectation that they will move at the whim of wherever the regulatory bar is set or wherever the incentives are set. Now, if there's one thing I heard consistently whilst in office when it came to climate policy, it was we want certainty. Now, I totally accept that if you're a company and you're building out your long-term plan, you want to know where the incentives or the policy or the regulation. If you're an oil company and, you're deciding whether or not you're going to continue with exploration, you want to know whether or not there will be a ban on permitting in the future. I understand the need for certainty, but in a democracy and in an environment where we're seeing such fluctuations in government policy, including someone declaring climate a hoax, We have to implore that the private sector build their own certainty, and the best way to do it is look at the bare minimum of where the progressives are and put your bar above it. And then you can be guaranteed that you are not going to be sitting below where anyone else's expectations will be. Not only do you create your economic certainty, you're actually then also demonstrating that you're building in some morality into your baseline as well.
Prime Minister Carney, before he was Prime Minister, was doing his best to when he was Mark, was doing his best to reform the international financial institutions to deal with these challenges of global inequality, to deal with climate change. Those are institutions that were set up now, I have to do my math, 70 years ago. How are they functioning? Can we get more out of them? Is that a place where leadership at the national level can force more change at the World Bank, at the IMF, and at the regional development banks?
We must do it. I mean, there's a lack of legitimacy. This is clear because the system was created 80 years ago, and nowadays we have very strong regions and economies that are asking to have more presence and therefore more capacity to influence the decisions, and of course to have representatives leading these agencies, which, by the way, I think it's also very important. By the way, I'm firmly defender that the next Secretary General must be a woman. And I think this could also be a very positive signal of the dynamism of the multilateral system. So for instance, from the Spanish perspective, we in the conference in Seville for financing of development, what we proposed is to reform some of these financial institutions. And today, the government is working in launching a proposal for reforming the global health system. I think that we are suffering a backlash on global health. We need financing global health. I think that we have a very important private sector companies also committed with global health. But again, we need to be prepared for future pandemics or potential health problems that we would need to challenge and respond multilaterally. And this is something that again begins with vaccines. How do we engage countries, governments and private sector in financing vaccines on HIV or TB, malaria and another kind of illness? And in the case of Spain, we have announced that over the next 2-3 years we will increase our contribution by 400 million euros for this kind of let's say policies. So there's a lot of things that we can do. There's a lot of things that we can do to transform in a more effective way our multilateral institutions. But I think that the only thing that lacks is a common political willingness from the major countries. But as Jacinda said, I think that from the medium-sized countries, we can influence a lot when it comes to moving forward in this direction.
Well, you both led your countries through the pandemic, and I think we probably underestimate how much that affected the psyche that is ongoing with people. And we came out of it. You brought your countries out of it. You've restored a good economy again. But I think there's still a lot of hangover. But Jacinda, maybe lessons learned on how the international system could respond better to these, pandemic crises and other crises that are that have the potential to sweep the globe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with that and then just pan back for a moment if I can. You know, my take would be, yes, we are dealing with the after effects of something that fundamentally disrupted, I think, as human beings, some of the certainty we thought we had in the world. And I think it has exacerbated something that was probably already there. I don't think it was the sole cause for, you know, the entrenchment and the additional polarization we see and the disaffection. I think it sped up something that was already there. And that's something I think fundamentally we can still trace back to deep insecurity amongst our population, whether or not it's fueled then by pandemics or climate change or technological advancement and disruption, which fundamentally shakes people's beliefs on whether or not they can wage a bet on a long-term career. All of that is creating this fear and anxiety and uncertainty. And in the wake of that, you know, we've already seen what happens when politicians capitalise on that with fear and with blame, including blame towards multilateral institutions. Not only are we seeing that domestically immigration is often used, but we're now seeing, of course, multilateral institutions be implicated in that as well. And so the response at its core is that progressives have to be willing to challenge the systems that have poorly served our people. And that will be both domestically, but it will also be at an international level. And there the answers are emerging if we're willing to grab hold of them. I remember being in a room when there was a gathering such as this after the global financial crisis, and we all felt so complicit as progressive parties that we were unwilling to look at those initiatives that may have been more significant to try and address the growing inequality in our nations. But we must be willing to do that. Otherwise, I fear this angst, this sense of disenfranchisement will continue.
So,
Pedro,
well, no, I think that as Jacinda said, somehow there's a clear progressive way of thinking when you define public goods. Definitely, health is a public good. Security it is indeed. Of course, climate change, and therefore we need to find means in order to funding commonly, all together, all countries. These public goods. And on the other hand, I think that we have to praise science. And unfortunately today we are witnessing anti-rational and not founded on scientific data and facts most of the political positions of prominent leaders. So that is why I think that the big lesson from pandemic, at least from our perspective, is that we need to create this interface between policy making and science. And this is what we are trying also from Spain to do.
Also prevent more pandemics because they are just incredibly difficult to lead through.
So my takeaway, we're out of time, but from these two wonderful leaders is clear offer, get elected, reform, and deliver. That's the progressive playbook. Thank you. That was great.